the Grand Concert Hall, built for a full symphony orchestra. But tonight, just one man walks out on stage. He's carrying a beat-up guitar and wearing the biggest grin you've ever seen. That's Julian Bream for you.
And this was a phenomenal thing about Bream, is he had this wonderful confidence and stage character, which the moment he walked out, he established the most incredible rapport with the audience.
All with his tiny music box, and what the guitar couldn't deliver, he made up for with pure charisma. To understand our instrument, we really need to understand Julian Bream. This video is made possible by Tonebase, your first address for all things classical music. A lot of the interview material is taken from Tonebase premium live streams. Links in the video description. Now, this isn't your typical story of a superhuman virtuoso doing impossible things on stage. Truth is, even back then there were players who could play faster and cleaner than Bream, even at his best, no doubt. But he still, in a lot of ways, changed the instrument more than anyone before or after. And yes, I'm going to say it, maybe even more than the legendary Segovia himself.
Let's not beat about the bush. He played difficult repertoire to the general public. You know, he didn't pull any punches. He basically commissioned new stuff and would play long, complex pieces to everyone.
That's new, that one. That's good. Yeah.
No, it isn't. No, it's
think
exactly as you wrote it.
I think it is, but you got it better.
Oh, that's very nice. Got it better.
His audiences weren't just the usual classical music crowd. They were young, they were excited, and they couldn't get enough of him. Even today, talk to most pro guitarists and you might be surprised, their hero is really still Bream. He's the one they're trying to follow. Bream was a musician of his time, whereas Segovia was probably more of a 19th century maestro who managed to stay alive well into the space age. Segovia's approach was careful, it was traditional, and it was easy to digest. Don't understand me wrong, that made the guitar incredibly popular, but Bream knew exactly how to build on that. If Segovia was the stern and impressive father of the classical guitar, Bream was its cool and radical uncle. Every time Bream comes up these days, somebody will actually compare him to Glenn Gould, who was of course the piano's radical uncle. People love comparing these two, and at first glance it makes a lot of sense. Both were brilliant minds who weren't afraid to challenge composers' instructions if they had a better idea. They thought like composers themselves, always seeing the bigger picture. Both were extremely smart and witty, creating rapid and complex associations out of nowhere. But there's a lot of differences too. Gould was way more hostile towards his audiences and critics.
I detest audiences.
He'd rather lock himself away in a recording studio forever than deal with people. Bream also had his moments, but he ultimately lived for the stage. He genuinely wanted to share music with people, even the weird, complex stuff that usually cleared rooms.
Right.
So maybe that's just the difference between piano and guitar. When you're playing guitar, you kind of have to be friendly and approachable. After all, if you're not, nobody can hear you.
You feel that you're being introduced not to one piece, but a whole kind of range of characters within that piece. You know, so you're not hearing a monologue, you're hearing an entire sort of Shakespeare play. More than anyone else really had up until that point, and really since, is really explore what the guitar does best. And we know this is not playing loud or playing fast, but most of us spend most of our time trying to do that.
let's set the scene. England in Bream's early days wasn't exactly a musical paradise. The country was struggling, and not just economically because of the war. They had this weird relationship with their own classical music, almost like they were embarrassed by it. London had always been this incredible melting pot of culture. The wealthy elite could bring in the most amazing musicians from anywhere in the world. And when you can import talent, why bother growing your own? Anything foreign was seen as exotic and exciting. Anything homegrown, well, that was just boring, sometimes even suspicious. It's a lot like the Premier League. The world's best football players come to England, making the league incredible to watch, but the English national team, for a lot of their history, they're underperformed because local talent gets overlooked. Same story, different stage. For guitarists, this meant the local scene was practically dead when young Bream came along. A century earlier, giants like Soar and Rigondi had played in English courts and fancy salons. But by Bream's time, you could count successful English guitar compositions on one hand, maybe even one finger. In a twisted sense, the war happened at the right time for the young Bream. With international artists stuck at home, England's guitar scene finally had to look in its own backyard. And what did they find? A kid with extraordinary talent, and a father who was about to become classical guitar's most ambitious stage parent. Henry Bream was on a mission. Even when Julian was barely a teenager, his father already plotted nothing less than a total transformation of the entire guitar world. A lot of what made Julian Bream unique actually started in his father's mind. Julian and his father were very hands-on and incredibly stubborn at times. Not all of their ideas stood the test of time, and when they tried to convince the local guitar society to have Julian play his recitals on this absolutely awesome 9-string monster of a guitar, the entire story could have ended already here. After a lot of heated letters about what even is a guitar, the Guitar Society finally decided to continue the support of young Julian, though really there weren't many other options in England at the time. He didn't play the Machiavelli guitar though, sadly. Then something big happened. Of course, Segovia. He has his hands in most of our stories. The greatest guitarist in the world came to London for a concert. Henry and the Guitar Society somehow managed to get Julian an audition with the master himself. Segovia was already in his 50s then, though amazingly he'd keep performing for another 40 years. What happened next sounds almost like a fairy tale. Segovia listened to Julian play, and if the reports are correct, he was actually fairly impressed. He didn't just praise the boy, he even offered to take Julian on tour for a whole year as his personal apprentice. Now, if a famous celebrity offered to take your 14-year-old kid on a world tour today, you probably have some questions. But Henry was actually so starstruck he agreed on the spot. Nobody seemed to think about the practical details. Looking back, Julian probably dodged a bullet. A few months later, Segovia completely backed out of the offer. Henry was furious, but the whole experience convinced him that Julian's future was with the guitar. And Julian just kept doing his thing, getting better and better until he was probably the best guitarist in England. Pretty impressive for a teenager who couldn't even study guitar properly at music school. It wasn't a thing in England at the time. He had to enroll as a piano student at the Royal College and practice guitar on the side. No wonder Bream ended up with such an unusual approach to playing. When you have to figure everything out for yourself, you do things differently. Sadly, Henry never got to see just how right he was about his son's future. He'd always said Julian would make it big once he played Wigmore Hall. And that's actually exactly what happened. Everything about Bream's playing was uniquely Bream. His programming choices, like a succulent meal. His interpretations full of spirit and surprise, just delightful. His technique, really nothing that you can teach. Bream himself would be the first to tell you not to copy him. While people tend to create schools of playing whenever there's a big success in the classical music world, Bream's theatrical flair and unconventional technique were like a custom-made suit. Perfect for him, probably doesn't fit anyone else.
Bream's technique, of course, was amazing. It was idiosyncratic for sure. He didn't have the most efficient use of his body. There's a wonderful photograph of Bream and Williams playing together, and Williams is sitting there, the sort of, incredible Alexander Technique type posture, everything looking incredibly relaxed and just this amazing sort of setup that he had. whereas Bream is kind of hunched over the instrument like this, you know. Now, what he was is what all artists need to be, which is aware of their strengths and their weaknesses.
His right hand never quite settled into a stable position, constantly shifting and adapting, like a painter mixing colors on a palette. Bream was only interested in finding the perfect sound, even if it meant his fingers had to contort themselves to get there. It wasn't always pretty to look at, but most of the time it worked really well, actually. To Bream, everything he did was a form of expression. He always tried to give his best, and his decisions, while sometimes seemingly chaotic, were meant in service of the result. Bream himself admitted his technique wasn't the most efficient, and he had to deal with several devastating injuries throughout his life. The truly unique quality about his playing was less in the physical movements, but in his extraordinary awareness on stage.
And if anything, what I learned from him was more that I was thinking, gosh, my pace of life and my way of doing things is so fast and kind of agitated, because he was always noticing all these little details, a little bit like with them in the music, when his attention to detail, but the same when we were driving and he would point out this flower and this plant and this thing about this building, and everything was so slow and calm in the house, this silence, just the ticking clock and the plodding dog when he was alive, just walking around. And he would notice, I don't know, I had this folder that was like some not very nice folder that I got from Smith's, just a shop in the UK, and he was like, oh, that's a beautiful folder, beautiful colour, and it was just really sweet attention to detail that I wasn't really used to, and a love of the small things.
Most performers try to block out distractions. They try to enter this zone, but Bream seemed to absorb everything, the lighting, the acoustics, the person coughing in row 3, and somehow he wove it all into the performance. This heightened awareness extended to his recording philosophy too. Working with his trusted engineer John Bauer at Warder Chapel, often in the dead of the night, Bream insisted on capturing performances in a real acoustic space rather than a soundproofed studio. He was extremely fussy about even minute details, and the technical quality of these recordings is absolutely excellent. Bream went on to record more than 60 albums, on average almost 2 per year until his retirement from performance in 2002. Maybe most remarkable and revolutionary was his 1966 album, 20th Century Guitar. At a time when most guitar albums were safely nestled in the warm embrace of Spanish Romanticism, Bream dropped something that must have seemed like it came from another planet entirely. The timing was of course perfect. Psychedelic rock was just taking off in the US and the UK. Bream knew exactly what he was doing, come on. The album is a musical handshake between two worlds. In one corner you've got the old guard. Bream tips his hat to Segovia even in the liner notes. He closes the album also with 2 of Villalobos' etudes, pieces that were dedicated to Segovia. Of course, though, Bream picks etudes that Segovia rarely or never played. Again, Segovia paved the way, but Bream goes a lot further. And where he goes is pretty wild for the time. The star of the show is of course Britain's Nocturnal, a 20-minute-long rumination on the nature of sleep. It's incredibly mysterious, atmospheric, deep and varied. I love this piece. It's closing magnificently with a yearning ode to death by John Dowland himself. Bream's performance itself is also absolutely mesmerizing. If you want to learn more about this milestone composition, check out Steve Goss's excellent and very detailed video for free on tonebase. Links in the description. Bream had this amazing, maybe slightly crazy habit of just walking up to famous composers and asking them to write for guitar. Seriously, he'd just call them up or catch them on the street. It didn't always work, but when it did, then sometimes he got a Nocturnal written for him. One specifically famous story is of course when he approached Stravinsky out of the blue with his lute. Amazingly, this interaction was filmed by chance. Bream got us heaps of new music into the repertoire, but he also helped push the early music revival by picking up the guitar's older cousin. Some early music enthusiasts were actually less than thrilled about this. Here was this guitarist playing with nails, taking liberties with their historical performance practice. He got a lot of slack from that. Bream's performances, of course, probably did more to popularize this early music than most other lutenists could ever dream of. While some of the solo lute recordings really just sound more like guitar than lute, they're still vibrant and exciting. And many of the recordings with this consort are just delightful to listen to. All of the chamber music stuff, honestly. Bream also thrived a lot in collaboration with other musicians, another thing where he went further than Segovia. The duos with Peter Pears and John Williams are of course the best known. With Peter Pears the singer, Bream recorded a lot of albums, many of which are songs by early English composers. Dowland of course being the most prominent here, but there's also excellent music by lesser known composers from that time period, as well as Britain's fantastically moody folk song arrangements, and stuff by William Walton and other great English composers of that time period. The Bream-Williams duo was unsurprisingly massively successful, although the two were an odd couple with their playing styles being so different. But they matched surprisingly well, creating a very distinct sound and popularizing a lot of nowadays standard repertoire for two guitars. While Bream's solo albums are generally the most popular recordings in the catalogue, and it's interesting to note that the modern tastes have become more conservative again, with the Spanish recordings being the more popular ones. I really think there are some forgotten gems where Bream played with other musicians. There's so much more we could talk about with Julian Bream, his guitars for a starter, but let's postpone this to another future video. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified. What can we learn from this proper English gentleman who revolutionized classical guitar? First, don't sacrifice expression for safety. Playing clean but flat only impresses other guitarists, but Bream was a musician first, and he saw himself as part of a broader music community to which he never stopped advertising the unique strengths of the guitar. Second, charisma isn't optional, it's an essential part of musicianship. It's about having something to say and the courage to say it in your own voice. Third, don't forget to state your purpose. Bream always knew exactly why he was playing. Early on, his father gave him this mission. Create a new way of playing guitar, something different from the Spanish tradition. Pretty ambitious. But what I love most is what happened later in his life. When injuries forced him to quit, he still kept practicing, and his purpose was no longer to impress. Just changed his goal to something much simpler, to keep brain and body in sync. Try that next time you pick up the guitar. It's what we should all do. Even after all of these years, the classical guitar world is torn. On the one hand, we want to be a proper classical instrument, with strong ties to academia and high-quality education, to create even higher feats of sonic perfection. But on the other hand, the most celebrated players are often the ones that walked a crooked path towards mastery, finding their own voice, even if that voice is a bit rough around the edges. When occasionally there is someone that bridges this gap successfully, guitarists hold on tight, and they want to cement that feeling. It's almost like watching a pendulum swing. Tárrega establishes a school of playing. His students turn it into dogma. Then Segovia comes along, opposes that dogma, establishes his own approach, which his followers promptly turn into a new dogma. Then comes Bream, and he breaks boundaries again. Now we have the ironic dilemma that creating a Bream school of guitar playing is not really possible. You can't really create orthodoxy out of a radically unorthodox approach. But still plenty of people tried and maybe even harmed the instrument in doing so. I don't know. Classical guitar as an instrument always has a bit of an identity crisis. It's stuck between worlds. But Bream, as well as other modern guitarists such as John Williams, who successfully bridged many other gaps, they prove that this can be a good thing. You just have to keep adapting. We don't have these huge towering figures anymore, like everything else in the world really. The guitar scene has diversified and turned into loose bubbles of interest. We've got so many different voices and all these different players' personalities. It's not the same, but it's not necessarily bad. If there's one thing we should definitely follow Bream in doing is to always try to have open eyes and ears for the good stuff around us and push that. And as guitarists specifically, it's not about playing like Bream, really. It's about finding your own voice, telling your own stories, taking your own risks, and most importantly, having fun doing it. This video was made possible with the help of Tonebase. Tonebase is an amazing learning platform that accompanies you throughout your musical journey, offering you comprehensive practice plans, detailed technical, musical and theoretical instruction, and hundreds of masterclasses, regular live streams, a vibrant community of fellow musicians, and so much more. Make sure to check it out in the link in the video description. Thanks for sticking around until the end. Another video on a great guitar hero. To no surprise, I'm outing myself as a longtime guitar nerd. I actually remember reading this brilliant book first when I was a teenager, probably in between some Harry Potter books. It's the most delightful classical guitar book that I know, and if there's one book about our instrument to read, it's really this one. I'm Jakob Schmidt for Tonebase. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.